Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Lawcast. This time, we're going back. We're going way back. We're going back to the territories. Cush, are you ready to talk about world-class championship wrestling?
I am ready to talk about this. I am ready to bear all of our emotions and go down one of the most depressing, tragic, evil, horrible moment like pictures of wrestling history to explain why world class was as big as it was, how it got as big as it got, and well, how it fell right into hell.
Yeah, it's a territory that caught fire pretty much overnight, went national, and even to some extent global, and then lost it all almost as fast. And along the way, if there's about 10 things that happened in this territory that if just one of them had happened, you'd be like, wow, that's so sad. I can't believe that. The dominoes started falling and they just didn't stop in this territory. Like one thing just led to another. They had basically an Eddie Guerrero level tragedy every single year for years and years and years.
And that's the thing. The company's basically done in like 1988. The peak starts in like 1982.
Yeah.
So over the course of like 6 years, everything that you've heard about happening in world class happens in literally like a 6 year span of time, which is mind-blowingly insane.
Yeah. It is a fascinating story. When WWE did the DVD, they called it Triumph and Tragedy, and that pretty much hits it on the head.
Everybody who's ever been associated with that territory has such conflicted things to say about it, like loves it in their whole heart, but like it's not an exaggeration to say that they go from making Dallas maybe the hottest territory in the world to making it literally unrunnable for any other promotion for like 2 decades afterwards. Like I've never seen a scorched earth thing like this in wrestling before. It's
It was,
crazy.
it was the 80s. It was just too much. It was larger than life. It was drug culture. It was steroids. It was the whole thing. Like, I've always felt like if you were going to do like a scripted drama about wrestling, I would basically want to set it in world class championship wrestling. Like,
Yeah, just redo the show Dallas, except have him be a
yeah.
wrestling promoter instead of an oil baron.
The stuff that happened in this territory is too crazy to make up.
This is a company that goes through like four bookers in 3 years. This is a company who has to shuffle top stars literally from year to year based on what happens. This is a company whose top heels walk out on it at least 7 different times. This is an absolutely insanely tumultuous promotion, and yet somehow managed to be one of the biggest success stories, at least for a little while, in the history of wrestling.
Indeed. And it all starts with the man who founded it, Fritz von Erich, real name Jack Adkisson, Texas boy, good athlete, played football at SMU, had tryouts in the NFL and the CFL. Couldn't make it in pro football, but while he was playing up in Canada, he met Stu Hart and got trained to wrestle in the dungeon. He debuted in the Calgary territory, and they teamed him up with his quote unquote brother, Waldo von Erich, as two evil Germans. And not just Germans, like actual Nazis who would goose step and do the salute.
It really makes it even stranger that he's eventually going to turn like mega babyface. Because I don't know how you turn a Nazi babyface, to be honest, especially not in the 60s.
You know what? They pulled it off.
They pulled it off.
Um, he won Fritz became a huge star. He was a big guy. He wrestled like a savage. Won the AWA title in 1963. Won the Missouri title out of St. Louis, which was frequently the grooming title for the NWA title. Like you'd get the Missouri title, and that was your test. Fritz never got the big belt, but it didn't change hands real frequently in the 60s.
Oh God, no. And like that's the most important thing to remember is this all starts in the 60s. It doesn't really like form its crescendo until the early 80s. And basically what we're going to start telling you about is like one through line story that starts in like 1966 and runs until like 1988. It's one of the wildest things I've ever seen.
Well, to me, the story is he didn't quite make it, and he desperately wanted his sons to.
Yes. So basically he starts a feud with Gary Hart in like 1966, right?
Yeah.
And that feud runs basically for the entire duration of World Class Championship Wrestling.
Yeah.
I mean, it's big time wrestling first. It's not world class until the
Yep.
80s when they decide to go on their own. But literally, this feud, and like Gary Hart just brings in a new monster of the month, and eventually Fritz like decides to hang it up and just pushes his children into wrestling. It's debatable whether or not they really wanted to go into it themselves. It seems like at least David did, but like you can't imagine a worse stage dad than Fritz von Erich.
No. I mean, Kevin mostly has good things to say about him, but it does seem when he's like trying to attest that he was a good father, it's very strained and defensive.
And it certainly seems like Carrie got the brunt of the badness, as like Carrie was the. We got to talk about the kids, I guess, but
Yeah, we'll get to that. I mean, how could they not want to go into wrestling though? Growing, I mean, just about every wrestling kid wants to go into wrestling. It's something we've talked about a lot. Is just the madness of. I mean, maybe the Kevin's kids getting into wrestling is one of the craziest examples to me. Like after everything that family had gone through, that they end up getting into wrestling too.
and it's all of the kids.
Yeah.
Lacey, Ross, and Marshall, I want to say, and they're all in the wrestling business. I think Ross and Marshall are a tag team in MLW right now. Lacey famously was in TNA, and they took advantage of her, the poor thing. But like that, it's just wild. Anytime you see your dad be a star when you're a kid,
Yeah.
it's just hard not to follow in those footsteps.
Yeah. And yeah. Fritz was also over big in Japan. He helped rebuild Japanese wrestling after Rikidozan was murdered. We'll put a bookmark in Japan because we'll get back there later in the story.
Oh yeah.
So the way Texas wrestling was organized at the time is basically Paul Bosch out of Houston controlled the whole state. Fritz wanted to take over the Dallas office. Sam Mushnick out of St. Louis, one of the most powerful NWA promoters, backed Fritz, and they did whatever they needed to make things good with Bosch, who was also quite powerful in his own right. Fritz got to take over the Dallas office along with Ed McLemore, who owned the Dallas Sportatorium, which would become their signature arena. So they buy the territory in '66. And then in '69, Fritz takes over as the sole owner when McLemore dies of a heart attack. But long before any of this happens, the Von Erichs lose their first son, who some people have never heard of because he died so young. He was only 9 years old, 7 years old in 1959 when he was killed in a just like kind of freak electrocution accident. They lived in basically a trailer, like a nice like trailer house, because they moved so frequently they could just kind of move the house with them when Fritz would go to a new territory. But somehow Jack Jr., little Jackie, came home from school and touched some exposed metal that electrocuted him, and it knocked him out, and he fell into a puddle and drowned, is the explanation I've heard.
That's horrifying. Like,
Yeah.
for most families, that would be the worst thing that had happened in generations.
Yeah.
That's going to be maybe the least tragic death of all of these.
Yeah, but it just kind of set the tone for the family. I know Kevin was born by this point. I'm not sure if any of the other boys were. They would have been very, very young at this point if they were.
I think Kevin and David are the oldest, and maybe David was, but I don't think Carrie or definitely not Mike.
Yeah. So the Dallas territory at the time is big time wrestling. Fritz being both the owner and the top star in the territory kind of follows the typical pattern that you saw a lot of places. Eddie Graham in Florida, Vern Gagne in the AWA, Bill Watts in Mid-South. It made sense that if you were the owner, you would make yourself the top star because you knew you weren't going to leave. It was hard to trust anybody else.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you would just bring in a flavor of the month, and that's basically how the territories kept themselves fresh. Yeah. Is most people would only go and see the shows like once every, like maybe 4 times a year, right? some would go see him more often, but mostly just like a couple times a year. And basically just be like, oh, my top star, our hero of this area, our hometown boy, Vern Gagne, versus the monster from wherever. And then that guy would just be gone and you'd cycle somebody new in. That stayed fresh for decades for
Yeah.
some places.
It's not that hard to book. Like,
No.
guy comes in, he squashes people for 3 months, he gets to fight the champion. Either the champ beats him or like maybe he beats the champ by like disqualification or some bullshit, and you come back and you do the blow off the next month if you do that way. Like, yeah, you could just do this forever, and a lot of these territories did.
Yeah, and since there's no TV or anything, you never see these champions lose. Like Andre could just do AWA. Not that Andre ever lost, but if he did, he'd just go to the next territory. No one there knew he ever lost. Like it's basically an infinite cycling door. It's amazing. It was an amazing business model.
Yeah, so Fritz has transitioned from being the monster of the month, which he was. He had his run up in New York against Bruno and traveled the circuit as the new villain to fight the champions. Now he's the babyface champion. He turns face for a run against Gary Hart and Gary Hart's stable. And like you said, this feud basically runs for 20 years. Like the Von Erichs versus the Harts, versus Gary Hart and his team, just never really ends.
And like it's literally the feud that we're going to talk so much about later on is obviously the Von Erichs versus the Freebirds, but like that's not really the feud at the heart of this promotion. Von Erichs versus Hart's stable is literally the backbone of World Class and always was. And Gary Hart, especially because Gary Hart was the booker for a large period of time, and he would just book himself on top constantly because that's just what you did.
I think Gary Hart is one of the most underrated managers, promoters, bookers. I just don't think he's ever really gotten the credit he deserves because his big runs never had a big run in the WWF. I don't even know if he was ever in the WWF. And, he had little run in WCW in like 89, 90, but, WCW was kind of a joke at that point, and he was getting pretty old by then.
See, that's the thing, is if World Class had succeeded,
yeah,
then he would be remembered as one of the greatest bookers who ever lived. And he probably already should be, because I don't think the special thing about Gary Hart and the special thing about World Class is they were not afraid to book storylines that were long. Basically, every single storyline in the entire company interconnected with each other. Every character in the company interconnected with each other. Every storyline would last for years and finally culminate. Like, I've never seen a territory run in this way, where, like, the entire thing is just like one living organism, and every payoff was just so epic and grand and would draw tens of thousands of people for the blow-off because they had waited so long for it. He believed in booking heat so much. Yeah. He was a genius.
He's got a book that I would absolutely love to read, but unfortunately it like went out of print years ago and there's no Kindle version. On Amazon it is $424 new.
What?
75 used, but I wouldn't trust that it would actually show up. Like, this thing is a gem. It's not available. They're just like, they stopped printing it years ago.
That sucks. Like,
I know. I'd love to read this thing.
You just got to imagine, like, he's got some pearls of wisdom, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I guess after you've made yourself the top star, your goal is to hold on for long enough to transition the throne to your kid or kids, which, doesn't usually work out in wrestling history. Greg Gagne, Eric Watts, Mike Graham, not quite.
Jeff Jarrett, Brian Lawler.
Dustin Rhodes, almost.
But basically, can you think of another time where it ever did work? I mean,
there's some great second generation, Kurt Hennig, Ted DiBiase.
Yeah, but none of them drew in the territories their dads were in.
Yeah, it just didn't work out, and their dads didn't own the territories. Was the
that's the thing. It's just for some reason, and it could be that some of these guys could have been talented down the road. It's just that the pressure to follow your
way too fast,
just to be like a kid and be like, okay, your dad's the top star in the territory, go fill his fucking shoes.
And like we know the hit rate on second and third generation wrestlers, it's not incredibly high. For every
No.
Randy Orton, for every, Ted DiBiase Sr., there's a Ted DiBiase Jr., there's a Sim Snuka, there's a Manu. It's hit
Yeah.
and miss. Sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't.
And a lot of the time, the ones that do work out, they get put in the business so early that their star almost like flames out well before they were ever ready. Like most wrestlers aren't ready to be good, top quality wrestlers until their 30s at the earliest.
Yeah.
So a lot of these kids are breaking in at like 21 because their dads got them into the business early, and they're just not ready.
One, I don't think the wrestling business is not a place for somebody in their early 20s. It's
Not at
just
all.
not. And I mean, I think if you look historically, most top guys had their biggest money runs when they were between 35 and 40. It just took them that long to like figure out their character, figure out the psychology, get to the right time and place.
Yeah, I mean, just there are so many examples of this, but I'll just pull one out of the air. It's like AJ Styles was an amazing wrestler for all of his career. He didn't even develop a personality for the first time until he was like 35 years old.
And get the look right. And
Yeah.
yeah.
It takes ages to like perfect that. To like learn how to cut a promo, to like learn how to tell a story. It takes forever. It doesn't take long to learn how to wrestle. It takes forever to learn how to be a good talent. And so look at Cody Rhodes. He was in the business for like 15 years before he finally got to the place where you see him now, where he looks like a goddamn superstar, but that's not how it was.
So Fritz had 5 sons after Jack Jr. Kevin, David, Kerry, Mike, and Chris. Kevin is the oldest, and he's the only one who's still alive, believe it or not. And he's been the only one alive since, like, I don't know, 1993.
Yeah, you got to feel like, I don't know if he's a superstitious man, but you got to imagine he's the kind of person to throw salt over his shoulder if he spills some.
He's probably the most athletic of all the kids. He was a high flyer. His signature is that he wrestled barefoot. This became his thing just kind of by accident. Somebody played a rib on him and hit his boots right before a match, and he went out to wrestle without them. And, it just kind of worked. He had a good match, and from then on, he would wrestle barefoot. Now, kids, don't wrestle barefoot. It's a terrible idea.
It always backfires. Always. Every single
You will
time.
break your ankle. You will get your foot stepped on and get it broken. It's a horrible idea.
Does not matter how tough you are. Ask Rusev. It happens every time.
Yeah. I mean, Kevin was really good. He was probably not world champion material. He was kind of like your intercontinental champion, like workhorse babyface.
Yeah. What really developed was that there were two who really seemed like there are a lot of times where people push their kids into the business when they just absolutely shouldn't be. I'm looking at you, Eric Watts. But there were two here that genuinely radiated star power. And those were David and Kerry. And like literally, even if they weren't your kids, you would have pushed them because they look like goddamn superstars.
Yeah, David is the second oldest. He's probably the most well-rounded of all of them. He's huge. He's, I don't know, 6'6" or 6'7".
And he's like lanky, but he's got a good look to him. And by all accounts, had a brilliant mind for the business. Would help Fritz come up with so many of the storylines and stuff like that. Like he's like a future genius, basically.
Yeah, he was a good athlete. He was probably the best worker of any of them.
Sure.
Good promo. A lot of people were predicting he was going to be the NWA champion.
Ric Flair full on came out and said in his book that the NWA had already approved him. And that Rick was just waiting to hear when he was going to drop it to him. Like that's what was going to happen.
I refuse to believe he was going to be a long-term champion because Jim Crockett controlled the NWA by then, and he wasn't going to let a non-Crockett guy be the champion for very long. So I suspect that would have been like a Tommy Rich type title run that wouldn't have lasted for very long. But just the respect it showed that they were willing to put the belt on him says a lot.
Yeah, and it's entirely possible, too, that Crockett just wanted a piece of what World Class had because they were white hot on fire at this point. So it's probably just like, I want to bring David into my promotion and then offer him some of my money and see if I can get him to jump ship on his dad.
Yeah, Flair against the Von Erichs is some of my favorite stuff from this era.
It was just, and what's funny is we're going to talk so much about Gino Hernandez and that whole thing. That's
Yeah.
basically just an extension of Ric Flair versus the Von Erichs, because Gino Hernandez is just another Ric Flair.
Kerry had definitely the best look of any of the Sons. Just an amazing physique.
Just a Greek
Incredibly
god.
built.
Tiger beat good looks and
Yeah.
absolutely shredded, and just he looked like a Mr. Olympia or like a football player just stepping off the street. Like Vince McMahon always talked about that guy that you see in the airport and you know he's a pro wrestler. Kerry Von Erich is one of those guys.
Yeah, I would say, putting on my Q Scouts hat, this is the guy I would want to build my company around. Like, this is my number one baby face.
Here's the problem with that, though. As is often the case, the guy with the most tantalizing skill set and look is not necessarily the most stable of the group, is not necessarily the best promo. He has actually a lot in common with like kind of like an Ultimate Warrior in terms of he was basically one of the most carryable wrestlers of all time, but he was never going to have a good match on his own. So the fact that he was in here with a lot of the greatest wrestlers ever to live really helped.
Mike was the second youngest. Everybody says he never wanted to be a wrestler. Like, he wanted to help out backstage. He wanted to be a cameraman. But Fritz kind of forced him to get into the business. They needed David dies, and they need another Von Erich. So they kind of draft him in to be the third brother against the Freebirds. And it will end in just horrible tragedy.
Say, there are a couple things along the way here that I don't know that we've really made this clear yet. Fritz Von Erich is a douchebag. Just, like, in some ways, an absolute monster. And you can kind of understand how he gets to some of the decisions he gets to. When your business is going down because one of your sons died and you desperately need to fill in, and, oh, hey, there's Mike at the breakfast table. I get how your mind gets there, but, like, this winds up being an absolute horrific tragedy that was 100% Fritz's fault.
And then maybe the saddest of them all is Chris, who's the youngest brother. He is super tiny. He's like 5'5". He is not physically cut out to be a wrestler, but he desperately wanted to be a wrestler like his older brothers. It's just, younger siblings often have older sibling envy. His big brothers are wrestlers. He wants to be like them, but he never should have been in the ring.
He just doesn't. It's not just to say that he doesn't have the physique. Like, he's actively frail. Like, it's like, I can't imagine any doctor would have cleared him to do this. And they, whether through desperation or just him wearing him down, they let him in, and it goes exactly like the way you would think it would.
Yeah, he had asthma, and the medication he took to treat it made his bones brittle, which, is the reason he suffered so many injuries when he tried to wrestle.
I mean, you can't have brittle bones and take bumps. It's just, you can't. It's not a matter of heart and determination. You just can't do it.
So yeah, the 5 Von Erich boys, and 4 of them will be dead by 1993, and we are in like 1976.
I say we're in 76, and like I literally feel like the Grim Reaper is standing right behind me as we talk about this. Like, it's so hard as a wrestling fan or any sort of like wrestling historian to talk about the Von Erichs, because it's not often that you feel like there are branching points in wrestling history, right? And if this doesn't happen, what we're about to lay out, it's entirely possible that World Class Championship Wrestling becomes like an actual competitor to WWE. It's very possible. It's entirely. We may not have had a WCW. Like, there's a real chance the NWA folds and World Class is who buys it. Like, that's what it seemed like was going to happen.
And as we'll get to, it's so much one thing led to another. Like, David's death is what starts the spiral here.
It's just, but one thing at a time. One thing at a time.
Kevin Von Erich debuts as a wrestler in 1976. In 1981, they changed their name from Big Time Wrestling to World Class Championship Wrestling. WCCW. That's 1981, as they're starting to market more nationally and globally. I just want to point out, Vince McMahon may have been the one who succeeded in going national, but many other territories tried.
Yeah. Bill Watts was somewhat successful with it.
UWF.
Yeah. There were a couple of different places that probably could have pulled it off if they had been given more time and opportunity.
AWA certainly tried. I mean, AWA was touring everywhere from like Ohio all the way out to Las Vegas, and they had TV on ESPN.
Yeah. The only problem with the AWA
It sucked.
product you could possibly lay your eyes on, but that's, it's not ESPN's fault.
But yeah, this is also about the time Fritz really starts investing in production quality. I don't know who was this Gary Hart's thing. Like, I've never been sure who's behind this, but man, their territory is just light years ahead of everybody else in terms of the production. Like, they put the microphones in the ring. They've got handheld cameras so the cameramen will get up close and get the shots from in the ring and on the apron. They start using music before anybody else does, and they make music like the centerpiece of their shows with the music videos and the entrance music for the wrestlers. Like, really, when I think of this territory, after Tragic Death, music is the second thing I think of.
Territory is why we have music in wrestling.
Yeah.
Bad Street USA is literally like the reason that half of wrestling is what it is today. Can you imagine how stupid wrestling would be if we had never gotten themes? How painfully boring it must have been before we had those music cues. Like, I can't even understand it.
Yeah, so, I mean, the Freebirds are not the first people to use music. May have been Gorgeous George, maybe Mildred Burke. I've heard different things, but it's been around a long time. But they're the first ones to use rock and roll music and to like really build their entrance around it and do it every single time. Started at, they had a couple different songs. They had Freebird by Leonard Skinner. They had Georgia on My Mind because they were from Georgia. I think the Willie Nelson version. And then, they settled on Bad Street USA when rights fees became an issue.
Yeah, when you go national, that's the problem, is suddenly people start paying attention.
But yeah, I mean, just the first promotion to really give all their top stars entrance music, popular music. Carrie would come out to Tom Sawyer by Rush. Gino Hernandez and Chris Adams would come out to Bad to the Bone. Just a ton of popular theme songs.
And it wasn't just the music. Like, as you said, it just looked like a better product. Like, since they owned the Sportatorium, they could basically do whatever they wanted inside. So, like, basically, it was one of the first major venues like that was really just set up for wrestling all the time. And I don't know. Like, the Sportatorium was a dump. Like,
yeah.
in many respects, like, it was like a much larger scale ECW arena. Not much larger, but in that it was a shithole, but it became like a holy ground for people, because when you would see it on TV, it would just look amazing and full and vibrant. And then when you could actually go there, you'd realize it's just like wooden bleachers that people have to like duck their heads to come through the curtain and get under. But it became like a magical place. And the production that they fed into it was a big part of that. Like they would make it seem like the wonderland of wrestling. It was very cool.
Yeah, and you just compare the way their show looks and sounds in 1981 to any other territory, including the WWF at the time, and they are so far ahead.
WWE looked like it was filmed in a dark closet at the time. Yeah. It was horrible.
Yeah. No music, terrible lighting, just the long shot from the side, no up close, no mic in the ring so you don't hear the bumps the way you would in World Class.
There's just so many, and like their talent, I can't get away from this either. Like, there weren't a lot of talents in wrestling at this point that looked like the way we would see future stars looking. So, like, obviously Hulk Hogan is the big one, right? But like Kerry had that look that was almost totally unlike anybody was in the business, and so did the rest of the Von Erichs. There just weren't a lot of like young, vibrant talents that like. A lot of the wrestlers were older. They've been around since the 60s. Like, AWA was run by
Harry,
like 45-year-olds.
They got pot bellies. They're gross.
Because that's just what wrestling had been. It was like real tough guys, but they didn't necessarily look good. World Class was the first place that really prioritized, like, do these guys look like rock stars? Cool. That's our talent.
Yeah. They really start getting hot in the early 80s as Fritz is winding down his career and passing the torch to his sons. Fritz wrestles his retirement match in 82 against King Kong Bundy at Texas Stadium. Fritz beats Bundy to win the NWA Americas Championship and then relinquishes the belt after the match. Fritz couldn't even do a job in his last match.
Of course not. Even with the belt on the line, he wins the belt and vacates it because of course he does.
Show actually doesn't do huge business. They only draw 6,800 at Texas Stadium, which is basically nothing in a stadium that size.
Yeah, that's kind of depressing, actually.
Yeah. Much better things to come. Namely, the Fabulous Freebirds, who first come together in Mid-South Wrestling in 1979. Bill Watts paired up Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy, mostly because Michael Hayes' matches were the shits, and Terry Gordy could work, and Michael could talk.
That's absolutely true. And it's so funny, too, because there was also Terry would kind of have to almost take the Triple H role at times, where, like, Michael would be so fucking tanked, he would have to have somebody, like, get him back to the hotel room.
Yeah. And then they throw in Buddy Roberts, who is the little guy, the worker, the bumper. Like, he's the one whose ass everybody knows they can kick.
I gotta say, Michael Hayes is the draw, the others do all the work. That sounds about right.
Yeah. Bam Bam is the big guy. Nobody can beat him, but everybody knows they could take Buddy Roberts.
Yep. And if you could just get Michael Hayes in a real one-on-one match, you could beat him, but you just never can.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've reached the point of the Freebirds, which means we've reached the point of one of the best wrestling angles in wrestling history. And that's how the Freebirds turn heel on the Von Erichs.
Yeah. Christmas Star Wars 1982.
There's not a lot of opportunities that we have to, like, paint word pictures here. There's not a lot, like, obviously, we didn't go back and watch, like, the entire fucking run of World Class Championship Wrestling. We don't get paid to do this, guys. But if you're talking about, like, moments that are specific, like, that are amazing and indelible in history, let me paint you a word picture of the turn of the Freebirds. And the genius of this, and this is Gary Hart's genius, is that at this point, Michael Hayes is the second most popular act in this company. They're baby faces, okay? And basically right below the Von Erichs is Michael Hayes. And they're having a cage match. And I don't even remember who are they facing? Who's Kerry facing?
It's Kerry versus Ric Flair for the NWA title.
That's right. Oh my God, I can't believe I forgot that. That's the big part. And, like, literally so often they've come so close to beating Ric Flair. Like, it's become this thing. And this is finally going to be the time where Flair's got nowhere to go. And they're going to have a special guest referee that the fans are going to choose. And I don't know if this is a shoot poll, but I feel like even if it was, they still would have picked Michael Hayes. He's the second biggest babyface in the company.
Yeah. So Michael Hayes referees the match in jeans and no shirt because it's Michael Hayes.
Of fucking course.
And Terry Gordy is guarding the door.
And the genius part of this is that throughout the course of the match, Michael Hayes keeps giving Kerry a little bit of help. Not a crazy amount, but he'll just kind of, like, look the other way so Kerry can do some stuff or, like, trip up Flair. And Kerry's getting hot with him, like, I don't need your help to win. I got this. I got this. And then finally Kerry's like, dude, like, please, you got to let me do this for myself. And
Hayes
just
punches out Flair and is like, pin his ass, Kerry. Like, it's over. And Kerry won't do it because he doesn't want to win the title that way.
And the crowd is going absolutely apeshit because they want Kerry to win. So they don't care how he does it. And, like, he's like, no, I can't win like this. I can't do it. And Michael Hayes just turns around and decks his ass.
Yeah. So Hayes goes to leave the cage. Flair runs Kerry into Hayes and knocks him off the apron, at which point Terry Gordy slams the cage door shut on Kerry's head, knocks him out, bloodies him. This really should just be the finish. Like, Flair should have just pinned him here, but instead the match goes on for, like, another couple minutes, and then the referee stops it because Kerry is bloody and passed out and can't continue.
This moment where Terry Gordy swings the cage door is like the moment in World Class Championship history. Like they harken back to it multiple times. Later, like somebody does it to Gordy to get revenge on him, and it's like this big satisfying thing. This is like that moment that they put in clip shows that is just like this is where everything changed.
Yeah,
And they become wild, out of control nuclear heels after this.
The territory has already been hot before this. Like, this show drew 12,000 people and like a $350,000 house. But then Gary Hart ends up leaving the promotion a few weeks later. He's the booker and the big heel manager. He gets his payoff for the night after he's booked them to this huge success, and he only gets a $3,500 check. And he fights with Fritz about it. Fritz won't pay him more, so he walks.
And the Freebirds try to walk with him, and Gary Hart talks them out of it. Yeah. So this entire run with the Freebirds could have ended right here if Gary Hart isn't a good guy.
That would have killed. I mean, like, that would have killed the territory. To lose the booker and the top heels, I don't know what they would have done at that point.
Especially right after you launch this storyline, it's just like, oh hey, you guys have made enormous, enormous stars of the Freebirds, and they're going right up the road.
Yeah. Referee David Manning took over as the booker. I think he had already been helping book. And he manages to keep things rolling without Gary Hart. Like, they really don't miss a beat here.
Yeah, there are great bookers, and then there are people who, like, can keep stuff together. Yeah. And that's David Manning. Like, no really fascinating storylines happen while he's in charge, but, like, that doesn't matter. Like, he keeps it rolling, and that's what they need.
Yeah, I mean, they could just ride the Freebirds and the Von Erichs for the next couple of years, and that's what they do.
And again, we've talked before about how multi-man matches give you so many options, right?
Oh my God.
When you got like stables going up against each other, you basically never run out of different variations on matches you can have. You can like have singles matches, like real ones, like once a year. And other than that, constant tag matches, constant six-mans. You never run out of combinations.
Yeah, so they come back for the June Star Wars card. Star Wars was what they called their big shows. Like, they weren't on pay-per-view. They were arena shows that they would then air on TV afterwards. They drew a sellout of 21,000 people to see Kevin challenge Harley Race for the NWA title, which he had only won from Ric Flair a few days earlier, so this was a substitution because he's the new champion. And then Kerry Von Erich and Bruiser Brody beat Hayes and Gordy for the tag titles in the main event.
God, there are so many names that are associated with World Class that, like, it's hard not to, like, talk about, but, like, there's not really a lot of opportunities for us to say, except for Bruiser Brody was part of the reason why Bruiser Brody was one of the first big, gigantic international stars was that he would basically just hop back and forth between World Class and All Japan and became like a gigantic next level star in both, as both were starting to kind of go national and international on their own. And he just got that exposure. And he would go to Puerto Rico as well. So he was really one of the first global stars. There was probably a time where he and Andre were the two best known wrestlers on earth.
Just what an amazing look. I mean, basically picture Luke Harper, but even bigger.
And just had an energy about him, like he was going
seemed
to
like a wild
someone.
Man.
Like you can't bottle that, man. Like he would come out of the tunnel and you'd be like, oh shit, I gotta get out of here.
Yeah, just wrestled like an absolute savage. Was actually a very nice and soft-spoken man in real life.
That often seems to be the case. Like Stan Hansen's the same way. And, like, my first exposure to Stan Hansen was watching him literally, like, burst through the crowd at All Japan shows, swinging his cowbell and hitting, like, innocent people in the seats. And then it turns out he's just kind of a nice guy.
Some form of Freebirds versus Von Erichs headlined all the Star Wars cards for the rest of the year. They would do these, like, roughly quarterly. There would be one in the spring, one in the summer. They would have a Labor Day one. They'd usually do something around Thanksgiving, and then Christmas would be the big one. On Labor Day, Kerry beats Hayes in a loser leaves town steel cage match. Then on Christmas Day, Kevin and Mike beat Gordy and Roberts in a losers leave town no disqualification match. But mysteriously, the Freebirds never actually leave. Like,
yes.
They
That's
do leave eventually, but they don't leave here. They continue with the company into '84.
and it's not like they had plans for them to leave and they just fell through. They just never intended to honor this stipulation.
I hate when you book stipulations you know you're not going to follow through on.
Especially when like your entire business for the year depends on this, like people believing that this is real. That like, oh my God, if the Von Erichs lose, they won't be able to wrestle here anymore. Because again, boys and girls, this is the kayfabe era.
Yeah.
And a large part of the business, we have to mention, is the fact that these are good old boys from Dallas. Like they're your grandpa watched Fritz wrestle, and here are his kids, and they're just some good old boys. They're so nice, and they're young, and they're clean shaven, and they're like sparkly pure, and like those are like the perfect pure Texas boys. Like that, literally Texas pride itself was caught up in the Von Erichs.
Yeah.
And like that's so much about what this is you could bring any villain to go up against the Von Erichs, and it felt like those villains were attacking Texas itself, which they take very seriously.
Freebirds and Von Erichs was Texas versus Georgia. It was just like the Cotton Bowl.
There was a ton of Texas versus Oklahoma, Texas versus Missouri, Texas versus New York, Texas versus Japan.
Yeah. So as the calendar turns into 1984, tragedy hits the family again. David goes on a tour of Japan. He's feeling sick the day of, but Fritz insists, you got to make your bookings. He makes the long flight to Japan, meets up with some of the boys. They go out to dinner, have a big dinner at the steakhouse. Apparently he goes up to his room, he comes back, and he eats even more, which everybody is like, what the hell are you doing, David? Like, you just had 2 steaks at dinner, but he is just pounding beers and eating and stuffing himself. And then he goes up to his room, and he dies. He's found dead in his room the next morning. Cause of death, the subject of much speculation over the years. On the death certificate, it's listed as ruptured intestines from gastroenteritis. Ric Flair says in his book that it was a painkiller overdose and that Bruiser Brody disposed of the drugs to protect David's reputation, which I think is just kind of standard operating procedure in the business. I've heard this with many drug deaths, that like whoever's first on the scene will flush the drugs, don't want to ruin the guy's reputation, don't want to expose the business to that.
And it's not just like the normal story. Like every wrestler was on pills at this time. But the Von Erichs had staked their reputation on the idea that they did not do drugs, they did not party, they were good boys.
Good, like, God-fearing American boys.
Literally, Kerry Von Erich does an interview in the Dallas Star the next day that basically says, like he never even took painkillers for the pain. He just worked through it. He was just such a tough, brave man. Which obviously is bullshit, but like their entire personality was based on the idea that that wouldn't happen. Now, I don't necessarily think, I've kind of come around, I guess it has to be said, there are multiple conspiracies based around world-class championship wrestling. And like, I've tried desperately not to become the conspiracy theory guy on this podcast, but it just keeps coming up again and again. For a long time, I believed that David Von Erich had been murdered, as many people did. There was a big suggestion that he had gotten involved with like some Yakuza stuff, buying drugs. I don't necessarily actually believe that.
I don't know that he had ever been in Japan before this.
Yeah, I think that's my thing. It
doesn't seem like he had time to get in trouble. Like, it was his first night in Japan.
Yeah. It's entirely possible that he just had some really bad stomach issue, didn't get it treated, and then his intestines ruptured. That's entirely possible.
Bill Irwin claims David was bulimic, which,
well, there you go.
Hearing that story, there's elements of it that, like, he eats 2 big ribeye steaks at the steakhouse, and then they go back to the hotel bar and he goes up to his room. I think the suggestion is he went to his room and he purged, and he comes back down and he like orders another dinner, which everybody's like, David, like, what are you doing? Like, you're stuffing yourself. You got to wrestle tomorrow. And like, that could damage his heart. That could damage his intestines. That could lead to the issues that killed him.
It's definitely possible. Unfortunately, like, when you are a teen heartthrob sensation, as the Von Erichs were, the pressure on you to look good is
Yeah.
Unfortunate, but it's very possible that that was the case. This
Uh,
is devastating because he was the star. Like Kerry is who we think about now because he lasted longer and he reached higher heights, but literally he was gonna be the NWA champion, man.
yeah, he was probably going to get the belt this year. I still assume it would have gone back to Flair pretty quickly because I think they were going to go with Dusty versus Flair for the title at Starrcade that year, but who knows?
Yeah, and it may not have even been until after that. It's hard to say, but I don't know. Like he would have been a national next level star. That was the plan. The NWA had long term plans for David, and this is just
Yeah.
the NWA title to a large extent in the 80s was almost cursed. Like if it wasn't held by Ric Flair or Dusty, whoever touched it, it didn't end well for them.
Agnew TA, whoever
Yeah.
they were grooming to get it.
Yeah. Just like it was, and that was such a pressure-filled thing. And almost every time, like maybe drugs were involved, maybe it was a shady side of the business. So like a lot of stuff got brushed under the rug in honor of the NWA title.
Does it seem plausible that Fritz could have pulled some strings to get the death certificate to say what it needed to? Through his relationship with the Japan office, who, all Japan was connected with the Yakuza. Does that make any sense?
Here's
Like,
the thing,
the
and
promotion's reputation is riding on this not saying it was a drug overdose.
yes, it's I don't necessarily trust Ric Flair. Like he's certainly not the person that I would trust about whether or not it was a drug overdose. He certainly wasn't there. But look, organized crime was such a significant part of Japanese wrestling in the 80s and the early 90s for that matter. It was a gigantic part. And to the extent that most of the money men and investors in the major companies were Yakuza. So is it possible? Fuck yeah, it's possible, man. Wouldn't it be the first time? A lot of things like this happened in Japan where people would unfortunately have disappearances and accidents and their death certificates changed. Like I don't want to believe it, but it is very possible.
Oh, so after David dies, they have a tribute show 2 months later in May. It's the David Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions. They draw 50,000 at Texas Stadium,
50.
43,000 paid.
Holy shit.
Like, this is like a UT football game.
And like literally the list of the biggest drawing wrestling shows of all time at that time. I don't know where this ranks on it, but I got to imagine it's top five.
I think this might be number one. I mean,
It
how
might,
many stadium shows have there been to this point? What's the famous one? Jim Londos and Lou Thez,
yes. And
Pat O'Connor.
Pat O'Connor and Buddy Rogers wrestled in Chicago.
Yeah.
Uh, but again, those numbers are impossible to find
These are,
because
yeah, apocryphal numbers. Oh, there was 60,000 people there.
they were hanging from the rafters at Soldier Field.
Yeah. But yeah, this is one of the largest crowds in wrestling history to this point.
The outpouring of love for him.
Yeah.
5,000 people show up unannounced to his funeral.
Yeah.
Like this is
It was like a funeral for a head of state.
this is like Eddie, but it's even more personal somehow.
Like
Where like it's not
the Texas legislature did like a resolution of mourning, like yeah, like this was like a real sports star died.
because especially in the territory days, like these felt so much like your guys, right? Like this was your home team. This was your territory. You literally watched David Von
See the
Erich
Von
grow
Erichs,
up.
you'd see them, yeah, like they were high school football stars. You'd see them around. You might see them at the bar after a show. You might see them like out to lunch or working out at the gym.
Your grandma, who was a fan of Fritz, literally watched them grow up from small children.
Yeah.
And now here he's ready to be one of the biggest stars in the world, and he dies tragically. And it's not even at home, it's in Japan. It's a goddamn tragedy.
Yeah. Kerry in the main event challenges Ric Flair for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Comes out wearing a like special. It was either David's robe or it was one he had specially made that had the yellow rose of Texas, which was David's nickname. He comes out to the song "Texas When I Die" in tribute to David. He beats Ric Flair with a backslide to win the NWA title. Just storybook stuff. Like, couldn't draw it up better.
Like, there are stories from people who were at this show. And this is one of those shows where everyone in the wrestling industry was there.
So you hear
everybody who ever lived in Texas says that they were at this show. But literally, you see wrestlers get choked up talking about this.
Yeah. Imagine there's two brothers on a high school football team and one of them dies in an accident and then the other throws the game-winning touchdown pass on the final play of the high school championship game in Texas. It's a storybook. Unfortunately, we know the reality. Believe Flair has said he could smell alcohol on Kerry's breath when he got in the ring.
It has been said by more than one person that not only was Kerry devastated by David's death, and not just because of it being his brother's death, because now the full gaze of Fritz was on Kerry.
Yeah.
All the pressure was on Kerry.
Oh, that's
and
tough.
Kerry was not a man who could handle pressure.
No. It's very similar to the Kennedys, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
With just one after another. Okay, John Jr.'s dead. Now Jack has to be president. Jack's dead. Okay, Bobby's turn. Okay, Teddy's the only one that's left. Well, Teddy's not really cut out for this.
Yeah. It's so depressing to watch because Kerry basically falls apart in front of our eyes. And unfortunately, he's going to fall apart very publicly because people are actually going to see he gets deep into drugs. I don't know how deep he is into drugs already at this point. It's certainly going to get a lot worse. And he's the one that people start to realize that the Von Erich veneer is not what it seems. And that's the worst thing that could happen.
Yeah, Kerry only holds the belt for 18 days before he drops it back to Flair in Japan. This was never going to be a long-term reign. Like I said, Jim Crockett controls the NWA at this point. He's not going to let the belt be on anybody who's not one of his guys for long. So Flair, they give Fritz the respect of letting his son win the belt here in tribute to his other son who died, but it's going right back to Flair.
Yeah, and it's also entirely possible that Fritz had already put the deposit down on the belt, so they may have had to give him a title change.
I do wonder about that element of it. That's an interesting one.
Because if you put the $100,000 down because David's going to win it, I think somebody has to win it, right?
So the Freebirds leave the territory that summer. They're in the WWF for literally a minute.
I can't even believe how quick that goes.
Andre the Giant literally throws their bags out of the locker room and is you no work here. I don't like you.
Andre the Giant had the power to literally eliminate anyone that he wanted to, and he only uses it once, and it's on the Freebirds.
Yeah, they did not mesh with the locker room. They're there for a couple weeks and they're out of there. And then they just kind of run the circuit. I think they have a good run in the AWA after this.
Yeah, they literally go everywhere, and they're heat magnets. And this is one of the reasons why the Freebirds are one of the first really national acts, because they go on this run right around the time that everyone starts to get their television.
Yeah. So
the Freebirds are one of the first people who pop up on everyone's TV. So if you go back to the living memory of when WCW rolls around and becomes a national promotion, the Freebirds are one of the biggest acts on it because they're one of the few people that everyone in the country knows.
Yeah. So with the Freebirds gone, they need some new heels to feud with the Von Erichs. The solution is to turn Gentleman Chris Adams heel and pair him with Gino Hernandez, who's a well-established villain in world class. This is the dynamic duo. What do you think of these guys together? Gino Hernandez, to me, seemed like the most natural heel in the world. Chris Adams was kind of a square peg for a round hole here, I feel like.
Chris Adams is a really fascinating case Because there was a whole cotton industry in World Class of just young guys who are friends with the Von Erichs, like the guys they pal around at the ball at the like that was just the whole deal. Is they would show like, oh, Chris Adams is out throwing the ball around with Kerry. What a good boy. He's one of our guys' friends.
Very polite British man.
Yeah, and then you would turn them on the Von Erichs, and then they'd get heat, and you'd ride that for 10 years. Like that was just what the whole industry was built around. And Chris Adams wasn't amazing. He also turned out to have his fair share of demons, which may very well be from being actual friends with the Von Erichs.
Yeah. Yeah, but he did actual jail time at one point, I think.
For manslaughter, yeah.
God. Yeah. Checkered career in life for him. He ends up dying, I don't know, late 90s, early 2000s. He dies very young.
Yeah, but he actually winds up being like the heavyweight champion of like the promotion.
It's like he's the only guy who's still there.
Yeah, he's the one who, once everything starts to go bad, they kind of build it all around him. And he does an okay job. I wouldn't say he did an amazing job, but he's at least got some talent. Gino Hernandez is dripping with charisma.
Gino was the fucking man.
Like, if it's hard to draw any comparison other than basically like Ric Flair.
Yeah.
Because he lived the gimmick like Flair did. He wore the finest suits. He wore the golden jewelry. He fucked everything that moved in the state of Texas and abroad. He was that guy. And like the fans bought it and believed it. And like, so like the sleazy Gino Hernandez, who's like just dripping with oil money going up against our good old boys. It's such an incredible storyline for Texas at the time. Because we can't tell the story of World Class without telling the story of Dallas.
Yeah.
Which is just that there's so much money in Dallas in the 80s.
Oh, I thought you meant Dallas, the TV show.
Oh, no. I'm talking about just...
I don't know. Same time. Dallas is 70... God, Dallas was on from 78 to 91.
Wow, that's the same run as World Class.
TV was different back then.
But the reason Dallas, the TV show, was a thing was just because Dallas had become such a center of money in this country because the oil was exploding in terms of the amount of money.
Corruption, SMU football, the Pony Express.
Basically, everyone in the city of Dallas became a millionaire overnight and had no idea what to do with that money, and they just all decided at the same time to become sleazy assholes. So basically, Gino Hernandez was like the personification of that sleazy asshole. Of just like the sleazy dude you see at the club who's got his dad's money and he's just buying up everything and there's nothing you can do about it. That's Gino. I fucking loved it.
So Adams smashed a wooden chair over his friend Kevin Von Erich's head in October '84 to kick off that rivalry. Few things I like in wrestling more than a good wooden chair shot.
Also, he fucked it up and literally like hit him with the hard part of the chair and like busted him open. And so they took like thousands of pictures of it because they were like, well, I guess if he did it, we're just going to take advantage.
Might as well roll with it.
He had, like,
let's not have that be for nothing.
He just had like a huge split in his forehead. It was disgusting.
Yeah, so this ends up being a pretty worthy sequel to Freebirds versus Von Erichs, and like this keeps the money rolling in.
Oh yeah, like there are very few angles in wrestling that draw quite like friend betrays friend, and this one's really good. And the funny thing is that people keep this residual like for Chris Adams from when he was friends with the Von Erich, so he's gonna turn babyface and heel again like 10 more times. Like he eventually they always just turn him back face because fans just actually love him. Even though they are paying hand over fist to see him get his ass kicked here.
That feud culminates in a hair versus hair match where Adams and Hernandez get their heads shaved.
Yes.
Yeah. And then they were going to split. They split and they were going to feud, but that gets cut short by Hernandez's untimely death, which we'll get to a second. But first, we got to talk about Lance Von Erich.
Yes. So Fritz Von Erich looks around his household and says, well, shit, I'm running out of Von Erichs.
Yeah. This is after Mike suffers a really bad injury during a tour of Israel. He like separates his shoulder, develops something called toxic shock syndrome. He's in the hospital. He has some insane fever. I've heard 107 degrees, which I can't believe doesn't kill you, but it probably damaged his brain. He probably never should have gotten back in the ring, but he did anyway. But so David's dead. Mike is hurt. They're down to Kerry and Kevin, and they need 3 Von Erichs for the 6-man tags. So they bring in a guy named Ricky Vaughn, who's a pro wrestler, pretty good wrestler, good-looking kid who had grown up in Dallas and like been a football star. But they bring him in and they say, "Oh, this is our cousin, Lance Von Erich." This is always talked about as like the downfall of the territory. Like somehow it was okay for the Von Erichs to be on drugs, but it was not okay to lie and make up a fake Von Erich.
Because it exposes kayfabe. Like everyone who had watched the Von Erichs grew up know goddamn well that they don't have a cousin named Lance. Yeah. Like people know your family. You've been here for 40 years. Like you're not gonna fool people.
No, and like they knew Ricky Vaughn too. Like he had
grown that's up the thing. It's just it's kind of a disaster. Like of all the things that Fritz does, and some of them are borderline absolutely sociopathic, this is the one that gets him the most heat. Like to this day, people are like, "What a fucking idiot thought he could get Lance Von Erich over on us."
Yeah, Gary Hart talks about this as like having come back to the territory and being a heel, and like having people come up to him around town and be like, "Gary, I just don't understand why Fritz is lying to us about Lance." Like they're supposed to hate Gary Hart, but they're still coming up to him like, you know, inconsolable that they're being lied to by Fritz and the boys.
It's so hard to explain to people that like the way the territory system worked and how seriously people took it. It's not necessarily that people thought everything was real. This is like the mid-'80s by this point. People are getting a little bit smart to the business. But it's at least that, like I said, this is your hometown team. You believe that they wouldn't lie to you. Like, even if the wrestling matches aren't 100% real, at the very least, like they're on the up and up. This is the family. We follow and we believe in this family. Yeah. And I don't understand why they couldn't just have him become like a friend of Carrie's. Yeah. Why does he have to be a Von Erich?
Difference does it make? Yeah, they have tons of friends. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, this is just Carrie's new running buddy. He met him up at doing a track meet up in Missouri.
Yeah, whatever. But yeah, Vaughn ends up getting fired from the company. I think he goes and signs with like Bill Watts, and Fritz has to like condemn him and like publicly admit that he wasn't really a Von Erich and apologize to the fans. Like it's a surreal clip because it's like a politician got caught having an affair is the way it's like he's talking about this.
It's a disaster. Like it's embarrassing for everyone involved. It's just it was a stupid short-term like decision, and he couldn't find his way out of it, and he got what he had coming.
Yeah. So on the heels of that disaster, we have another one, which is one of wrestling's great mysteries, which is the death of Gino Hernandez. He was found dead in his apartment after not showing up for several shows. When they find him, he's been dead for days, like his body is decomposing. A gun is found next to his body, but he has no injuries, like defensive or otherwise. There's no sign of forced entry at the house, but his deadbolt is unlocked, and his mother and his ex-wife say he always locked his deadbolt. Like, well, as we'll get into, he was very paranoid at the end of his life, so they say he was incredibly diligent, that when he was home, he always kept the deadbolt locked. He's, you know, both the wife and the mom say, like, for the last few months, he had been talking about how there were people out to get him. He had started carrying a gun. Like, he had gotten into some stuff. Like, he was into drugs, maybe more than just using them. It seems like he may have gotten into drug trafficking.
The story surrounding Gino Hernandez is so fraught with all sorts of interesting little things. Obviously, he was doing tons of cocaine during this point, which you don't need a reason to be paranoid when you're doing cocaine. The cocaine does that for you. So it's not like that part of it is necessarily that weird. The weird part comes in when the drug dealer that he's best friends with shows up at the funeral and talks
Yeah.
to the mom and says he owes him money.
Yeah, the funeral sounds like it was a really surreal scene where, he's got all his wrestling friends there, and then like there's these other guys there that none of the wrestling guys recognize, but they're all in super nice suits, and everybody's just like, "Oh, those are the drug dealers." And
Yeah.
then this guy, John Royal, gets up and delivers a eulogy as if Gino's like his best friend, and nobody at the funeral has any idea who he is. Everybody's
Not
just
the
like,
people
"Who?" Yeah, everybody's like, "Who the fuck is this guy? Like, am I missing something here?"
every day with him and had no idea who this guy was. Like,
Yeah.
it was a total mystery. He goes up to Gino's mom at the funeral and says, "Hey, your son owed me a lot of money." But he's also the guy who pays for the
Yeah.
funeral. It's bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, is there any other way to take, your son owed me a lot of money other than as a threat?
And here's the question. There are a lot of people who will go to their grave absolutely fucking certain that this was a hit that was put on Gino and he was murdered. And there's some compelling evidence to that extent. Like,
It
if
does
we're
seem like
talking,
something weird happened here.
yeah, if we're talking about conspiracies, this is the most credible
Yeah.
one.
So the
It-
coroner rules it a drug overdose. There is an inhuman amount of cocaine in his system. Also, I've heard they found cocaine in his stomach. You are not supposed to swallow cocaine.
yes, it literally seemed like someone stuffed cocaine in his mouth to try to make it seem like he had an overdose.
But there's no cocaine in the house.
And that's another thing.
But this is probably another case of the guys who found him flushed it. Like
Yes, that's
the
very
guys who
possible.
found it was David Manning and Ricky Hazard. Rick Hazard was a referee. They find him. If there's drugs there, they probably flushed it. Like it's again standard operating procedure in the business.
And that makes total sense. And I'm not saying that I necessarily think that Gino wasn't on
Or
cocaine
he
because,
just snorted all of it because he did overdose on it.
but he had so much cocaine in his system that it's almost unreal to think that he did it all. Like this is enough to kill you halfway to the end, and he had somehow kept going.
Yeah, there's also some weirdness with the autopsy. It said that he was Hispanic. He was not, despite his name being Gino Hernandez. He was adopted. We'll get into that in a second.
Yeah, that's a big
It
part of
said
the
he
story.
wasn't. It said he wasn't circumcised, which he was. Say both his wife and his mom, and they would know. And it
Yep.
also listed him as being morbidly obese, which I don't know. Maybe in the literal sense, maybe he was 6'1", 225 pounds or whatever. But he was sculpted, chiseled out of muscle.
Yes. One of the conspiracy theories that's floated around often is that somebody switched like the autopsies with somebody else's and just changed the names.
Or that he faked his death, which is a
That's
little.
another one, is that there are a lot of people who genuinely believe that he's still around right now.
Yeah, that I guess he was in debt to the drug dealers and he just went on the lam. How did he? Yeah, like who did they find in the house then? Whose body was that? This is a little too
I mean,
fantastical for me.
but it was extremely badly decomposed.
True.
So it's not like somebody had to be called in to ID it. You couldn't have ID'd it. It was too badly decomposed for that.
Yeah, it's just they found him in Gino's apartment and he was about the right size.
Uh, This is like one of those like shows you watch on TV and you're like, man, this is some far-fetched shit. I can't
Yeah.
even believe it's real.
Um, so John Royal went to prison for 30 years for cocaine trafficking. Only got out within the last few years. The producers of the Dark Side of the Ring show got in touch with him and like recorded a phone interview with him. He denied that Gino owed him money. He did say he paid for the funeral. He didn't actually have a lot to say. Just kind of said Gino was a nice guy. He played a bad guy on TV, but he was a nice guy in real life. Didn't get a lot out of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a horrible thing to say. Aside from the fact that he was, a known drug dealer, it wasn't really that bad of a eulogy.
Um, They also reached some anonymous drug trafficker from back in the day, like reached out to the guys who made the documentary and said he'd seen Gino drinking heavily and snorting cocaine that night. He said he didn't think there was any foul play. It's a mystery. It's a little unclear. I guess we should. The other mystery is who is Gino Hernandez's father. A lot of people in wrestling think he is Paul Bosch's son.
I mean, it's to the extent where, I mean, Bruce Pritchard, who would probably know as well as anyone on the face of the earth, is 100% certain that that is the case. So, I mean...
Yeah. I don't know exactly what that adds to the story, but it's just an interesting thing to throw in there.
Well, it's worth mentioning, too, like, I don't know that Gino necessarily... It's not like David, where he was, like, earmarked to be one of the biggest stars in all of wrestling history or anything like that.
He could have gone a long way.
But, yeah, he was almost certainly going to find his way to WWE at some point. And it's just... He had become wrestling royalty, and, like, Texas royalty to a certain extent. And for this to happen twice in, like, 2 years. But this one is so much worse than David's in a way, because everyone in Texas knows about the drugs. Like, they can't keep the autopsy a secret. So now it's, so what is everybody up there doing? And now literally, like, the focus begins to come on the drugs that are in World Class. And now people start noticing that Carrie's probably doing just a little bit more cocaine than is healthy for an everyday kind of thing.
Yeah. So just a couple weeks after that, World Class withdraws from the NWA. This had been kind of long in motion, but kind of a tough time to try to go national.
It's actually kind of funny because they decide to try to go national and they make Rick Rude their first world champion because which, I mean, he's a pretty good choice for your first world champion. Pro Wrestling Illustrated, who at the time is the only way you really knew what a world championship was, because they would list who the world champions were and all of their top contenders. And at the time, that was really the only way that kind of thing got distributed. They refused to put that it was a world title in Pro Wrestling Illustrated because the NWA was so angry that it blackballed them from that magazine.
Yeah, and maybe I care about this more than I should, but I wouldn't consider that to be a world title. It's only defended in Dallas.
It gets defended in Tel Aviv.
That's right. They did do some foreign tours.
Yeah, it gets defended in Japan. I mean, realistically, the NWA title is the only actual world title. But if you're holding it to that standard,
I've always said NWA, WWF, AWA were world titles in this era.
But where does the AWA title get defended overseas?
Oh, I'm sure they did foreign tours. The AWA is a national promotion.
Only if you count Canada.
They also get a TV deal on ESPN, as does the AWA. Yeah, this is like 1986. It's kind of remarkable that ESPN is still kind of slumming it with pro wrestling, but they needed this was cheap programming that lots of people would watch.
This is literally how the NWA gets on TBS, is that pro wrestling is really the only weekly product that looks like sports that you can put on, really.
Never takes a break, and lots of people watch it. Like, wrestling's drawn ratings since there's been TV.
And you can't really get like baseball and football and stuff like that because the networks own it, and it's a lot more regional as well. So there's really no functional way to have those products. Wrestling, you can just own lock, stock, and barrel. Hey, I'm Ted Turner, and I have Crockett Wrestling, and it's going to be on every Tuesday.
Yeah. They also changed their name to the World Class Wrestling Association, which I don't like nearly as much.
That sucks ass.
Yeah. 86 and 87 are tough years for the company. This is really the downfall. Ken Mantell, who had been booking in recent years, left the promotion after a dispute with Fritz. Fritz, pay your bookers.
There's also this weird thing where, like he said that one of the reasons he left is because Fritz refused to run outside of Dallas. It's not really true. I'm not sure what that's about.
No.
Like, they just had problems, obviously, is the big thing.
Yeah. Mantell goes to the Universal Wrestling Federation, which is Bill Watts has rebranded Mid-South Wrestling, that he's trying to take national, and they raid the company. They take Chris Adams, they take the Freebirds, they take Kamala, they get the one-man gang. Like, that's a pretty devastating loss of talent for a territory.
I want you guys to understand, too, that, like, everybody, Vince McMahon deserves every bit of ire he's ever received. But a big part of it is saying that he's the one who personally murdered all of the territories. Well, you got to chalk this one up to Bill Watts, because Bill Watts opened a territory right next door to World Class and then stole all their talent.
Yeah, it's just, look, it was a kill or be killed moment. Everybody can see where this is going. It's just a question of who's going to make it. And
yes,
it ends
somebody's
up,
going to be the last territory left. And
it's Crockett.
Yeah. But there was a time where it genuinely looked like World Class was in the best position to be that promotion.
Before everybody started dying.
I say, that's kind of what happens, yeah.
It's a little tough. The other problem they have here, and this is also what kills the UWF, is the oil bust of the late 80s. The price of oil falls dramatically in the late 80s, which is great for the average American who's filling up their gas tank for cheap, but really bad for all the people who are making a living in the oil industry. Suddenly all those oil wells are dry because they're not profitable.
Suddenly Dallas, which has become like this center of commerce in the country, becomes like half abandoned. Like, it's all the money drops out of the town in like a 1 year span. It's horrifying.
And then let's just add to the problems here. Kerry Von Erich gets in a really bad motorcycle on June 4th, 86. He tries to get back in the ring too soon. He re-injures his foot. Ultimately, it ends up being amputated. I've heard the story is, like, he, like, woke up from the surgery and they had told him he needed to stay off his feet for a while, and he just immediately, like, got up out of bed and, like, all the bones in his foot collapsed.
Yes, and not only that, but Fritz convinces him to get back in the ring against doctor's order. The doctors wanted him to not wrestle again.
Jesus.
And then the doctor said, okay, we'll give it like a year because some of the smaller bones will never grow back, but at least some tendons will grow there to kind of help brace it. And Fritz has him back in the ring in like 3 months.
God damn it, Fritz.
And yeah, he loses his goddamn... Imagine if Sting lost his fucking foot in 1989. This is nuts.
I mean, he continued to, like, you couldn't really tell he had one foot is the thing.
That's the amazing part.
He wasn't as good as he had been, but it's not that noticeable.
Wrestling with a prosthetic foot and like actually being good and like not good, but like passable in the ring. He was better than Warrior was. It's weird and outstanding, but also this just further fuels his downfall. Like the unspeakable Imagine you're Kerry, who by all accounts is just a nice, simple boy. Like, he's not the smartest like man in the world, but like he's a lovely guy to be around. He's a little bit gullible and prone to like his demons and stuff like that. But like, you've already been hit by bam David, bam Gino, bam Mike, and now you've lost your goddamn foot and your company's failing and you're the one who's supposed to carry it. Like, how would anybody respond to that?
No. Well, Mike Von Erich had been struggling for years by this point. The death of the older brother, the death of David, the shoulder injury, the toxic shock syndrome, the brain damage from that. He tries to get back in the ring. He keeps getting hurt. He gets arrested for a DUI, and then a couple days later in 87, he's found dead from a drug overdose. He's only 23 years old. Yeah. Like, it's all falling apart at this point.
Say, once the shots start coming, like any one of these things
yeah.
would have been enough to kill a promotion. But to have 5 of them
how can you be a fan of this promotion after all you're going through with it? This is in the course of 3 years you've had all this.
Yeah, and it's not just, oh man, a lot of bad stuff's happened in World Class. People loved these boys. People loved this promotion and this family. And to watch it just fall into ruin in front of your eyes, why would you pay money to see this happen? Like, what's left to pay money to see? It's disgusting.
Yeah, the tragedies are just kind of piling up. It's getting to be too much for the fans to take. They do another Parade of Champions show. This one is to honor both David and Mike. It only draws 6,000 people this time. Like, the territory's dead at this point.
Yeah, it's not the same. Not even close.
6,000 people in the stadium. At the 87 Star Wars show on Christmas Day, they do an angle where Fritz he fakes either a heart attack or a seizure, and they rush him to the hospital.
The news reports it as a real story.
Yeah, the news covers this as like, oh, Fritz von Erich, like wrestling legend, like has had a heart attack.
Like, okay.
What are they thinking? Why would you put the fans through this?
You've already had all of this tragedy.
God.
And, like, first of all, the fans are going to believe this because your family's fucking cursed. So, like, of course Fritz would die of a seizure in the goddamn ring. Of course he would. The idea that you need to build more sympathy for your family is outrageous. Like, anybody who looks at Kevin and Kerry at this point is looking at them with nothing but pity. That's not what you need to establish.
No, WCW did one of these with Ric Flair. I don't like heart attack angles. Just stay away from that stuff.
Yeah, that's just stupid and in bad taste, because by the time they do that, all the fans know that it's fake. So it's like, why are you even going there, man? Like, what are you trying to do? But here, the idea that people thought it was real, and the news reports on it, only to then find out it's fake, is one of the things that kills kayfabe in Texas. And that's just another, like, knife in the heart of this company, is now you're just prying open the door of kayfabe and just shining a light on your territory. Why are you doing that?
So as kind of a last gasp, they partner with the AWA and Memphis. Super Clash 3 is kind of the main show that they all do together. Kerry faces Jerry Lawler for the AWA title there. Lawler wins after the referee stops the match because Kerry was bleeding too heavily. Pay-per-view was a huge failure. They drew less than 2,000 people at the UIC Pavilion.
Basically, it's just, and it winds up just being an entire political thing where Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler basically wrest control of the territories away from everyone.
Yeah.
And just take it for themselves.
Jerry Jarrett buys a significant interest in World Class and renames it the United States Wrestling Association.
And we get, bizarrely, a promotion staged half in Dallas and half in Memphis.
Yeah. Jarrett cuts costs to the bone to the point that the company actually becomes profitable, but ends up in a financial dispute with Fritz. Jarrett moves the company back to Memphis. Again, the territory is essentially dead at this point.
The one fascinating thing about the territory at this point, and this is sort of the case with all of the territories around this time, is that all the stars are gone. Either they're with Crockett, or they're going to WWF, or they're about to be folded into like WCW. So all this young talent starts to come up and get opportunities. So like, this is right around the time that everybody starts coming through World Class.
Tons of stars come through World Class here. Steve Austin gets his debut September 30th, 89. The Undertaker wrestles his first match on TV against Bruiser Brody. He's like nuts. He's like under a mask as like Texas Red. He gets in 0 offense and gets beat in 3 minutes. But yeah, that's something. Shawn Michaels, I think, may have had his debut match, or at least one of his early matches, in '85 as a singles act. I think it was Shawn Sean at that point.
Yes, it was.
Mick Foley, early in his career, has a run in World Class in like '88 or '89. Ultimate Warrior gets a run there when he's the Dingo Warrior, but basically the Ultimate Warrior gimmick.
Yeah, absolutely. Big Boss Man gets a run here. Basically everybody comes through here because there's still some last vestige of popularity. Yeah, and now they can't pay their top talent anymore, so they need all this young infusion of young people. So there's a reason. Here's We're going to get to the legacy of world class later on, but arguably the biggest part of the legacy of world class is that, have you ever noticed how all the biggest stars in the 90s are all from Texas?
Yeah,
Isn't that
this
weird?
is why.
Yeah, guess what? They all grew up watching world class. That's why they all got in the business. Traditionally, what happens is when a wrestling company is at its peak, 5 years later, people from that area enter the business because those are like your 12-year-olds, your 13-year-olds. They turn 18, they want to be pro wrestlers now because they grew up watching it. It is like clockwork. This always happens. Trish Stratus enters the business, makes women's wrestling look good. Boom, women's revolution starts 5 years later. It's like clockwork. And there's a reason why your Stone Cold Steve Austin, your Bradshaw, your Undertaker, all of these guys start coming up in the late 80s. Because of world class is what they were watching, world class is what got them in, and then world class is where they got their first job. It's not a coincidence, but it's incredible how little this is talked about. You can just trace that effect across wrestling history.
Early in '90, they get dropped from their Saturday Night TV spot, which they had for literally, I think, decades at that point. That's pretty much the end.
Yeah.
Kerry finally leaves for the WWF, like years after he probably should have, but he just has no choice at that point. The last show is November '90. Kevin Von Erich beats the Angel of Death in the main event to win the Texas Heavyweight Championship.
And like it's almost like Kevin wins a prize for like making it all the way to the end.
You're the
Like
last Von Erich.
he's the last one.
I mean, not yet, because there's even more suicides to come.
You're right.
Yeah, Chris and Kerry are still alive. Chris kills himself in '91. Depression, drug addiction, injuries, failure as a wrestler, the family business going out of business, just chalk it up, like all
Yeah.
sorts of problems. He goes out to a peaceful, place out in the woods where him and his brothers would hang out, and he shoots himself.
Also, before this even happens, like Carrie and Chris become totally estranged from Fritz. It becomes this whole thing, like the family's falling apart, what's left of it. You could not have put a deeper hit job on this family than they did to themselves.
Fritz and his wife Doris get divorced in 1992 after being married for 42 years.
Yep.
Enough was enough, I guess. Kerry shot himself in the chest in 1993 after I think his marriage had fallen apart. He was in legal trouble. He had, asked his wife if she would, stay with him if he went to prison, and she didn't make any promises on that front. He,
Woof.
I think, went to the same place where Chris had killed himself and shot himself.
If your family has a place where you go to
Yeah.
kill yourselves, that's not great, guys. Oh boy.
So Fritz outlives all but one of his sons.
That's horrifying.
Yeah.
And the worst part is he's complicit in some of that. Maybe a great deal of it. We don't actually know.
Well, but yeah, we don't know for sure, but I'd say signs point to this was not the happiest family.
It's just, I don't know. When you look back at all of this, the highs were so high, man. There was like a 5-year period.
They were sizzling hot from
This
about
was-
like 81 to 86.
This was some of the best television that has ever been produced in wrestling history. Like some of the stuff that they were doing was light years ahead of their time.
Yeah.
The ideas that they had to like tour the Middle East, which was a market that no one in America had ever even attempted to really get
How
into.
nuts is it that Fritz von Erich, who played a Nazi character,
Yep.
his family was huge over in Israel for some reason. I've never quite figured that one out.
Gigantically over in Israel. I trust me, buddy, I don't know. But yeah, that's absolutely the case. They had so many great ideas and they were going so well. It's tempting to think about what could have been if none of this stuff takes place. But at the same time, I'm not sure that there's any version of this where it doesn't happen the way it does. Like David's was a freak accident, but everything after that was pretty much
Yeah, it's just dominoes. I mean,
yeah.
depression, drugs, stress, problems in the family. It just one thing led to another here. Fritz dies of brain cancer in 1997, and as we mentioned, Kevin is still alive to this day. He lives in Hawaii. Seems like he's actually doing pretty well.
Yeah, it's hard not to be happy
Shockingly
for him.
well under the circumstances.
He's tried to restart the promotion a couple
Yeah.
of different times. Obviously, that hasn't really succeeded. A big part of this is like after the oil money drops out and the fan basically wrestling is dead in Dallas until God, maybe the Attitude Era is what really brings it back because at that point WWF
all
could
the
have drawn
top
in.
all the top stars are Texans at that point.
Yeah, and WWF could have drawn on the fucking
Yeah.
moon at that point. It doesn't really matter. But like Steve Austin kind of revives it. But there's no way to bring World Class back. Like there isn't a more cursed name in the wrestling business than World Class Championship
Yeah.
Wrestling. And there's a reason. Like we just laid out to you like 10 distinct horrific disasters in a
Yeah.
5-year span. Like that I can't even say like while Bruno Sammartino was holding one belt for 5 years, this entire family is dying.
Yeah, if only one or two of these things had happened, you'd have been like, wow, what a tough series of things in that territory.
But for them
You
all to
just
happen,
can't wrap your head around the scale of the tragedy here.
yeah,
I
it's
mean, yeah, what could have been? Like, imagine a world where David doesn't die and maybe, the rest of this doesn't happen. I think
I'm
they could have made it national.
I mean everybody kind of fights over the ashes of the NWA towards the late 80s. And basically the remaining people were the AWA, Crockett, UWF, and World Class. But
Yeah.
World Class is pretty much done by then. But if they had been going strong, a lot of people thought World Class is going to be the one who bought the NWA and not the other
Yeah.
way around. If they had been going strong, UWF might not even be able to get a foothold.
Well,
So
yeah,
it's entirely possible that they're the last one standing.
think of it this way. Crockett when Ted Turner wants to get back at Vince in '85 after Black Saturday, um, this might have been the better option than Jim Crockett had the Von Erichs not been dying.
Absolutely. It's certainly it probably I think it would have been the safer bet at the time. Certainly Fritz was a more stable person, or at least seemed so, than Jim Crockett was at the time.
Yeah.
It's just they had more streams of revenue. They owned their own arena. They
Yeah.
had everything set up that they
The
never
the
needed to go
Sons were going to
anywhere.
be loyal forever. Like they were never going to bail on their dad,
Yeah.
unlike all the other territory stars who left for the New York money. Like I don't think they ever would have done it. Like Kerry finally did it in '90, but that was years after he really should have.
And like we're talking about a company where you could have watched Fritz's grandchildren become wrestlers. Like this could have been a company that lasted essentially forever.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the legacy I think here is just the highest of highs, but the lowest of lows. Like it's the best of wrestling, the most brilliant, the most successful, the most entertaining, but also just the darkest, saddest place.
I don't think I've ever been this sad. The only time I've ever been this sad doing the podcast is like times to talk about Benoit and like times to talk about Eddie. But this is different. This is just grim. It's difficult to bring up this chapter of wrestling history and still relish being a wrestling fan because there's just some things about wrestling that it's easier to forget about, you know?
This is not normal. Like it is not normal to have what, five sons die?
Yeah. But at the same time, the things that killed all of these sons are largely the worst parts of the wrestling industry that we've known. And it's like they all got killed by like a different sin of the wrestling industry. That's the horrifying thing of it. Aside
Yeah.
from David, who at least left the party before it got too bad.
The fame, the drugs, the wear and tear on your body.
The pressure, Just the
Stress and the
intense,
loneliness.
the pills you got to use to get by, the rampant cocaine abuse of that era. Like, it's all here. Like, it's just the story of the 80s. The 80s are what killed this company.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's nothing else you can really say.
No. No. So, from one tragedy to another much less serious tragedy.
Yeah.
Next time, we get to cover the 2004 Great American Bash, which is a tragedy of wrestling booking, but thankfully the only person who died was Paul Bearer in kayfabe.
And my heart died. Guys, I've had to review this multiple times. This is possibly the worst wrestling show ever presented, but in a hilarious fashion. This is the funnest show in WWE history for me. We're going to get to talk about Mordecai. We're going to get to talk about Kenzo Suzuki. We're going to get to talk about a handicap main event with somebody in a concrete and somebody committing actual murder.
Just an absolute disaster of a show.
Like, genuinely a show that somebody should have been fired for booking. Like, this is not a joke. It is amazing that anyone kept their job here.
SmackDown in 2004 truly is some of the worst TV the WWE has ever produced.
Thanks, Bruce Pritchard.
Yeah. So, all that and more next time on the Lawcast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week.